Hello everyone, my name is Peter.
I'm Keaton.
And today we're here to share some foundational knowledge with you about coffee's journey from farm to cup and everything in between. Before we get into the bulk of today's information, it's important to cover two key concepts that we really consider at Deeper Roots Coffee, and those are the concepts of character and quality. The definition around character is what is intrinsic to each coffee. So the naturally occurring characteristics of that coffee based on a number of factors. And then quality is more so, how do we evaluate that coffee? Are things being done along the way that are retaining the quality of that coffee, or maybe even adding quality to the coffee? The best analogy that I've always used is you can have two individuals like Keaton and I here, and we may have much different character, but that doesn't mean that our quality as individuals is not very high. So we can both be very high quality individuals with very different character. And I think the same can be said about coffee. That being said, one of the major things that can influence a coffee's character and quality, to be quite honest, is the biology of coffee.
We sort of haven't answered the big question yet, which is, what is coffee? And if you didn't know, let us be the first to tell you, coffee is a fruit. It's a tropical fruit, and we call that fruit the cherry of the coffee tree. It looks like a cherry. It's a small, round, red berry, and inside that berry are two pits or seeds, what we call coffee beans. So let's talk a little bit about that fruit. It has skin around the outside, just like any fruit, typically red, but it can be yellow or orange or pink. Beneath that, the two pits. Most coffee cherries have two. That's why coffee beans have this flat edge on there. Beneath that, there's a thin layer of pulp that we call the mucilage. It's very sweet, very tasty, but it is just a very thin layer because most of the cherry is taken up by its pit or its bean. Beneath that, there's a layer of parchment. Beneath the parchment layer, there is one final layer that we call silver skin that sometimes remains on the bean even through the roasting process. From now on, we're going to be referring to those not as the pits or the seeds, but as the coffee beans, just so we're all on the same page. Coffee is divided into two main species. We have Coffea arabica and Coffea canephora, more commonly referred to as Arabica and Robusta. You may have heard those terms before. Arabica is native to the cloud forests in highland Ethiopia. It produces higher cup scores. For us, that means more well-rounded flavors and complexity, lots of layered flavors. Arabica are still only about 3 or 4 generations removed from their native habitat in Ethiopia, so they really prefer the same type of climate that we find there. This all adds up to it being sort of a fussy plant that requires a lot of care being given to it. Robusta, on the other hand, we think is native to South Sudan. It's a lot hardier, it's more disease tolerant, and it can withstand higher temperatures, hence the name, it's robust, Robusta. And it also produces a lot more caffeine. So you'll find Robusta in a lot of commodity grade coffees, things you might find at the grocery store or at more fast food restaurants, instant coffee. At Deeper Roots, we serve only Arabica and Arabica hybrids. When you blend the two together, you can get disease-resistant Arabica plants. Not immune, but more resistant, which in this era of climate change and warming global temperatures is even more important than it used to be.
Now that we've discussed the biology of coffee, we can jump into where coffee grows and the conditions that are required for that coffee to grow well and thrive. There are 3 main regions in the world that coffee is grown. That would be Latin America, so Central and South America, Africa, and parts of Asia. And each of those regions of the world, they exist in between the tropics of Capricorn and Cancer. And they do share a lot of sort of universal truths as far as climate and things like that are concerned. But each of those parts of the world have their own distinct terroir. Terroir is a term that loosely translates to sense of place. And you see that word used a lot in other industries with other products like wine and cacao and even oysters. I've heard people use that term. And what they mean by that is you can eat or drink that product and get a sense of where that thing came from. So with coffee, each of these different distinct growing regions, they each have their own unique terroir and things like climate or microclimate in some cases. So that would include things like temperature, rainfall, sunlight.
Sometimes just the difference between one side of the mountain and the other even.
Exactly, yeah. So that's why you can get coffee from a few miles apart that can taste very, very different. The next thing is topography. The higher you go, the greater the difference is between the daytime and the nighttime temperatures of where that coffee is growing. And what that results in is a much more slow maturation of the coffee cherry, a slower ripening of the fruit, and the slower coffee ripens, the more complex sugars you're gonna have in that cherry. And what that leads to is a sweeter, more dynamic and complex cup. So elevation plays a pretty big role in the character and quality of each coffee. And the last thing in the terroir discussion is soil. And coffee really needs that fertile, nutrient-rich soil to have a healthy plant, and a healthy plant leads to healthy fruit. Usually you would like that soil to be well draining so that it doesn't retain too much water, but you do need it to retain some water because obviously that water is taken up through the roots in the tree. The three things in terroir to really understand and how it impacts coffee's character and quality are the soil that the coffee is growing in, the climate or microclimate, and the topography or elevation.
But none of that matters if coffee isn't harvested at the peak of quality when the cherries are perfectly ripe. So like we talked about earlier, coffee is a fruit, and just like any other fruit, it's seasonal. That means it needs to be picked at the moment of peak quality. In fact, a lot of growers have told me that once the coffee cherry is picked, we're only taking quality away from that point forward. Coffee also ripens unevenly. All this put together means that specialty coffee needs to be hand-picked. They need to visit the same tree over and over again so that each cherry can be picked when it's the perfectly ruby red color in order to produce coffees that are of the highest quality.
It's important to note that different parts of the world, different growing regions, will have distinct harvest seasons. And that's why, for example, on our offerings list, you may not see, a coffee from Papua New Guinea year round or a coffee from Mexico year round. And that's because they are harvested at different points throughout the year. So our goal is to source coffees in a seasonal way so that we're getting them when they're at their freshest, at their best quality. So obviously, once coffee gets harvested, we as the roaster don't receive that full fruit. We need to have that fruit separated from the pit of the cherry, the seed, or the coffee bean itself.
Buckle up, kids. Let's talk about processing.
I think the important thing to note about processing is that it can be one of the more important extrinsic factors when it comes to the quality of coffee that we're drinking.
Huge difference.
And depending on how well the processing is done, we can end up with a coffee that is much higher in quality or much lower. Processing can take away a lot of quality from the coffee, but it can also potentially add a little bit of quality as well. Today we're going to be discussing 3 more common techniques that are used around the world. We view those on a spectrum. And Keaton's gonna walk us through those 3 processing methods and kind of place those on the spectrum for you.
Processing as a whole is just getting the coffee beans out of the cherry and ready to be roasted. So let's start with the simplest way to process coffee, the way that it's been done, since coffee's discovery, which is what we call natural processing. Natural processing, sometimes called dry processing, it doesn't really have anything to do with how natural the coffee is. Like you might think that means clean or organic. That might be true, but that's not really what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is the coffee cherries are picked and then very simply they're spread out to dry. Now, coffee is a seed and it wants to germinate, it wants to grow into a new coffee tree. But by leaving the fruit on the coffee as it dries, we've prevented that seed from starting to germinate. When seeds germinate, they consume sugars. So naturally processed coffees retain all of that sugar that is present in the cherry itself. So in the cup, naturally processed coffees tend to present as very full-bodied, very sweet, often some very fruit-forward notes. It can trend into a little fermenty, a little funky if it's not carefully treated. It takes about 21 days for those cherries to dry out fully. before they can be removed as simply as just picking them up and rubbing your hands together.
Yeah, and these coffees, we refer to these maybe as like gateway coffees or the eye-opening coffees
For
a lot of people that are not used to drinking high-quality specialty coffee.
Yeah, we all remember our first natural coffee, I think.
Yeah.
On the other side of that spectrum is what we would call washed coffee or fully washed coffees. And the simplest way to describe a washed coffee is that we're going to use water and different bits of machinery to mechanically strip the fruit and mucilage away from the seeds themselves. Coffees will be floated so that any unripe cherries, which are less dense, will float and we can skim those off the top. Then those coffees will be run through something called a depulper, which is a machine that is set very precisely to a certain height so that it will skim the fruit and the skin off of the seeds without damaging the seeds themselves. After that, coffee needs to be fermented. Now, this is almost always done with water, although it can be done dry as well. The coffee is put into concrete, stainless steel, tiled tanks and submerged in water and left there so that the natural flora that exists in the environment can eat away at that mucilage, that sticky, slimy pulp. It's not precisely fermented in the sense of kimchi or sauerkraut, but we're trying to get rid of that mucilage, and on practical level, this is the quickest way to get it done. After that, the coffee needs to be spread out to dry. It's still contained in its parchment layer, which is gonna help protect it. Washed coffees tend to give us more complexity in the cup, more layers, and more clarity. We like to say that we can taste the region, the terroir a little more. We don't taste the process quite as much in really well done washed coffees. So remember, on the one hand, we have natural processed coffee. On the other end of the spectrum, we have washed processed. There's lots of variation in between, but let's talk about one more that sort of exists right in the middle, and we call that honey processing, or sometimes pulped natural processing. First thing to note is there's no honey involved. We just call it that because it's really sticky. And so what happens here is we skip the fermentation tank step. We strip off some of the skin and a little bit of the mucilage, varying amounts of the mucilage, and then we spread that out to dry for at least 24 hours before the coffee is then put into a mechanical dryer. And what this gives us is the best of both worlds. We get some full-bodied sweetness and fruit-forward flavors from the natural end of the spectrum, but we also get complex layers from the washed end of the spectrum. We love honey processed coffees at Deep Roots. Some of our closest partners do a lot of honey processing, and it can give us really amazing coffee.
Yeah, and I think something that we all really love about honey processed coffee specifically is that you're not quite sure what you're going to get, because you could end up with a coffee that's very fruit forward like a natural, or maybe it's a little bit more similar to a washed coffee. So yeah, I think what you said explains it perfectly. It's like the best of both worlds in some cases.
Yeah,
So
it's always surprising.
Yeah, honey coffees can be like super dynamic and really interesting. At this point in the processing of the coffee, we're left with coffee in parchment. So if you remember back to the coffee cherry anatomy, that's that sort of papery layer just around the green bean itself. So the coffee at this point, once it's fully dried, of course, it needs to be further processed to remove that parchment. And in most cases, this is done at a separate location at something called a dry mill. It's put through several pieces of machinery, one of which is obviously to remove that parchment from the coffee itself and get it ready for export. But the important step that happens at a lot of dry mills is there's a quality sorting or quality separation that's happening. These are all done in order to sort of separate these coffees into different grades. And that helps us to sort of evaluate where this may fall in the spectrum of quality. This is a point at which coffee is also sorted for certain defects. And there are machines called color sorters that are highly sophisticated and can actually remove one single bean out of an entire lot.
A lot of it's still done by hand too. Producers will just be gathered around a sorting table, visually identifying defects as the coffee moves, either on a conveyor belt or again, just by hand moving it down the line.
And then once that coffee is hulled and the parchment's been removed, it's then placed into what are called Grain Pro bags. This is a very thick plastic bag that will keep all of that freshness locked in. So they put this green coffee into Grain Pro bags, they seal that up, and then that Grain Pro bag is then put into these larger like burlap sacks. That's what we're all probably more used to seeing in coffee shops and coffee roasteries.
All right, so we've talked about biology, we've talked about cherry anatomy, we've talked about processing and harvesting. There's one really important step left that happens stateside, and that's roasting.
I think roasting is a step in the process that is all about ensuring that we do our best to retain all of the quality in the coffee from the moment that we receive it. All of the hard work done before we get it is what really contributes to the quality and character of a coffee. So our goal at Deeper Roots Coffee is to roast in a way to not just highlight, but to protect that intrinsic character of each coffee and really showcase what that coffee has to offer based on everything that we've already talked about. And for the most part, that generally is most representative in the light to medium roast level range. I think in the same way that there's a spectrum for processing, I think there's a spectrum for roast level as well, where if you are too far in these, say, like under roasted or underdeveloped side of the spectrum, you will have these negative flavor characteristics showing up in the cup. On the other end of the spectrum, the same can be said with over roasted coffee. You can get that really burnt, ashy, acrid flavor.
We talked about in processing that you can add flavor to coffee through processing, you can add quality, but you can do the same thing when you roast your coffee as well. If you choose to roast your coffee darker, you are introducing those roasty, ashy flavors to the coffee.
Yeah, so it may sound a little bit counterintuitive, but we try to roast in a way that you're not tasting the roast. We want you to taste the coffee. So the roasting process is really pretty simple. It's the monitoring of temperature over time. And we're using a few different types of heat to roast our coffee. We're using conduction, so the drum inside of the machine is actually picking up heat, and that's contributing to the roasting of the coffee. So conduction is one way. Convection is probably the more effective way as far as like the machine that we're using roast coffee. So that's the hot air inside the rotating drum of the roasting machine. And then we're also using a little bit of radiating heat from the beans themselves inside of the roaster, radiating a bit of heat. And there are many phases throughout the roasting process that we can dig deeper into, but I think the important thing to know is that philosophically, we're trying to roast our coffees again in a way that is not covering up any of the intrinsic sort of beautiful characteristics of each coffee and what that has to offer.
There's one more step in the process, and I'm sure you've guessed it by now, that's brewing it. I think this is one of the most important steps in the process because we've talked for a long time about what goes on at Origin and what goes on at the roastery and all of the steps involved. I think on average about 11 sets of hands have interacted with the coffee before it gets to you at home or us at the shop.
At least.
At least, if not more. And I'm thinking about all the work that's come before and all that quality that is present in that bean. And so me personally, and I think a lot of other baristas, I think Peter as well, we really want to treat it with respect and try to honor all of that that's come before.
Yeah, I think once you put everything into perspective, I really think it's that last step that can make it or break it. You can brew that coffee, so well that you're pulling out and highlighting all of that hard work, or maybe not so well and, I don't want to say ruining, but maybe ruining the coffee. So it's a very important last step in the chain that I think shouldn't be minimized. It's very, very important.
Yeah, you are presenting all of that hard work to the people that you're serving or your customers.
So we have really just scratched the surface on a lot of these topics today. This was meant to be a very basic overview with foundational coffee knowledge. There are probably hours of conversation that could be had on each of these topics. If you have more questions or you want to dive deeper into any of these things, you can always reach out directly to us. We encourage the questions and we love talking about this stuff.
Check out some of our other videos.
Yeah, we love coffee and we want you to love coffee too. Those are Keaton's favorite words. I took them right out of his mouth.
That's true.
Yeah. So thanks for watching, and until next time, cheers. What if we just smashed and just shattered?
I actually thought about that. Coffee just splashing up my face.